In the spring of 1945, the Empire of Japan stood at the edge of annihilation. For nearly a decade, the rising sun had burned across Asia and the Pacific, conquering cities, crushing armies, and carving out an empire that stretched thousands of miles. But now, that empire was dying. The vast oceans that once protected Japan had become a cage, closing tighter with every passing day. American submarines prowled beneath the waves, cutting the empire's supply lines. Bombers filled the skies, reducing cities to ash. Tokyo, once a proud symbol of modern Japan, lay in ruins, a smoking skeleton beneath the glow of American incendiaries, and yet, even in the face of inevitable defeat, the Japanese spirit refused to surrender. From the highest generals to the youngest school children, the message was clear: die, but never yield. The government called it the decisive battle of the homeland. The people called it destiny. At the center of this storm stood a new weapon, not forged of steel, but of flesh and blood. They were called Kamikaze, the divine wind. To the Americans, they were suicide pilots. To Japan, they were heroes, men who traded their lives for a moment of glory, hoping that through death, they could still protect their emperor and their homeland. It began in the closing months of 1944, after the disaster at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. Japan's once mighty fleet lay shattered. Its carriers were gone, its pilots dead, and its oil reserves dwindling. But where machines failed, fanaticism rose. In a small wooden briefing hut on Luzon, a Japanese naval officer named Vice Admiral Takiji Nishi addressed a group of young pilots. His voice was calm, his words simple: there is no other way to protect our country than to die for it. From that moment, the Kamikaze were born. Their mission was brutal and absolute: crash their aircraft, loaded with explosives, directly into enemy ships. Each attack was a one-way journey. Every man who volunteered signed his own death sentence. They wrote farewell letters to their families, posed for photographs beside their planes, and took off knowing they would never return. They came from universities, farms, and fishing villages. Many were barely 20. They spoke softly, smiled nervously, and carried tokens of home, a mother's charm, a photograph of a sweetheart, a strand of silk from a sister's kimono. The final ritual was always the same: they bowed toward the emperor's portrait, drank a final cup of sake, and then stepped into the cockpit. When they lifted off, Japan's fate rode with them. The first wave struck during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and their impact was devastating. American sailors, unprepared for this new weapon, watched in horror as flaming planes dove straight into their decks. Ships like the USS St. Lo vanished in pillars of smoke and fire. For a time, the Kamikaze seemed unstoppable, but for every American ship lost, Japan lost dozens of pilots. The empire's airfields were emptying faster than they could be filled. Fuel was scarce, and every mission drained the nation's lifeblood. Still, the attacks continued, each one a statement of defiance against a world closing in. By early 1945, Japan's last hope rested on a single island, Okinawa. Just 340 miles from Kyushu, it was the final barrier before the mainland itself. If Okinawa fell, there would be nothing left between the Americans and Japan's heart. The Japanese high command knew it was the endgame. They called it Operation Tengo, the heavenly operation. The plan was suicidal: to bleed the Americans so badly on Okinawa that they would fear invading Japan itself. Caves were dug into hillsides. Civilians were armed with bamboo spears. Teenagers were trained as suicide bombers. Every soldier was ordered to fight to the death. In April 1945, the horizon over Okinawa turned black with ships. The U.S. Navy had assembled the largest invasion fleet in history, more than 1,400 vessels, carrying 500,000 men. For the Japanese defenders, it was an armada of doom. As the American ships neared the island, air raid sirens wailed from hidden bunkers. Japanese pilots, fueled by desperation, climbed into their aircraft for one final sortie. The Kamikaze had returned, and this time, they came in waves. One American sailor described it later, they came out of the clouds like angry hornets, diving straight for us. There was no fear, no hesitation. Just fire. Over the next weeks, the skies above Okinawa became a storm of fire and steel. Kamikazes plunged into destroyers, carriers, and transports, turning the sea into a burning graveyard. Ships like the USS Bunker Hill were hit by 2 suicide planes in under a minute, killing nearly 400 men. The USS Franklin burned from bow to stern. Even when gunners shredded the incoming planes, fragments of flaming wreckage still tore across the decks, igniting fuel lines and ammunition stores. To American sailors, the Kamikazes were terrifying, men who refused to value their own lives. But to the Japanese, they were saints. Newspapers printed their names. Temples rang bells in their honor. In Tokyo, the last few factories that still functioned shifted production entirely toward suicide planes, small, fast, and deadly. Among them was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, the cherry blossom. It was a human-guided rocket, carried under bombers and released near the target. Once detached, the pilot would ignite its engines and dive at 600 miles per hour into enemy ships. There was no landing gear, no escape hatch, no second chance. The Oka became the ultimate symbol of Japan's desperation, beautiful, tragic, and utterly doomed. Back on Okinawa, the ground battle had begun. American Marines landed under heavy artillery fire. The beaches turned red with blood. The Japanese army, hidden in elaborate cave systems, refused to show themselves. Every hill, every ravine, every patch of jungle became a death trap. The Americans called one area Sugar Loaf Hill, a mound of dirt barely 50 feet high. It took over a week of fighting and thousands of casualties to capture it. Civilians were trapped between 2 armies. Many were forced to fight or take their own lives, driven by propaganda that painted Americans as monsters. Mothers drowned their children in the sea rather than face capture. Entire families leapt from cliffs, shouting "Tenno Hika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor! To the American soldiers watching from below, it was beyond comprehension. To the Japanese, it was the final proof of loyalty. Still, day by day, the island fell. The Americans advanced inch by inch, while kamikaze raids continued overhead. Each suicide attack became more desperate, more chaotic. Some planes never even made it to their targets, running out of fuel, crashing into the sea, or being shot down miles away. But the few that did strike left scars that would never fade. In one chilling diary found after the battle, a kamikaze pilot wrote, "I am not afraid to die. Only that I will fail to strike true. May my body become a shield for the Emperor." By late May, Okinawa had become hell on earth. Rain turned the island into mud. The air stank of rotten smoke. Japanese soldiers, starving and exhausted, fought from tunnels like ghosts. American flamethrowers burned them out one by one. Admiral Nishi, the man who had created the Kamikaze Corps, listened to daily reports of failure. Tens of thousands of young men had died, and yet Japan's enemies still came closer. In private, he began to question his own creation. But it was too late to stop. The machine of death he had built now moved on its own. As the Americans closed on Naha, the island's capital, Japanese commanders issued their final orders: fight until the last man. There will be no surrender. By early June 1945, the thunder of guns over Okinawa began to fade, replaced by the dull roar of rain and the low hum of aircraft still circling the island. The battle that had begun as Japan's proud last stand was collapsing into silence. The hills were cratered beyond recognition, the green fields had turned to grey clay, soaked with the remnants of 2 armies that had fought each other to exhaustion. American forces now held most of the island. Their flag stood on ruined ridges where nothing else remained. Yet inside the labyrinth of caves beneath Shuri Castle, a few thousand Japanese soldiers still resisted. For them, surrender was not a word that existed. Officers told their men that death in defense of the emperor was eternal honor. But hunger and sickness were stronger than any code. One by one, the tunnels went quiet for the United States. Okinawa was victory at an unbearable cost. Over 12,000 Americans were dead, 36,000 wounded. The U.S. Navy had lost more men at sea than in any other campaign of the war. Across the fleet, sailors spoke of nightmares filled with flaming planes and endless alarms. Commanders began to wonder what would happen when the same desperate spirit defended the Japanese homeland. Reports from the front shocked planners in Washington. If Okinawa, an island of farmers and fishermen, had demanded so much blood, how many would die on Kyushu or Honshu? The answer seemed unthinkable. Yet the war was not over. Tokyo still refused to yield. In Japan, the news of Okinawa's fall arrived like a funeral bell. Cities were in ashes, railways broken, food nearly gone. Families huddled in bomb shelters every night as American B-29 swept overhead. Each raid brought new devastation. Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, one by one, they burned. Still, the radio told the people to endure. The emperor, it said, awaited the decisive battle that would save the nation. Admiral Nishi now lived among ruins. Every morning he visited the airfield south of Tokyo where the last Kamikaze squadrons waited. The pilots were younger than ever, some only 17. They trained in obsolete planes patched together from spare parts, fuel so scarce that each flight was rationed by the cup. Yet when he asked for volunteers, every hand rose. He watched them march to their aircraft, white headbands fluttering, faces calm. They smiled for the photographers, wrote final letters home, and spoke quietly to one another as if leaving for a routine mission. When they took off, the air vibrated with engines and the echo of shouting ground crews. For a few seconds the sky filled with white trails, and then they were gone. Few of those planes reached their targets. The American fleet had learned to fight this new enemy. Radar picket ships formed walls around the main task force. Fighters waited overhead. Each day the kamikazes came in smaller groups, each attack more desperate than the last. Some pilots never found the sea, others crashed into the waves long before reaching the ships. By July, the attacks had nearly ceased. There were no planes left to fly. Nishi understood then that Japan's sacrifice had achieved nothing. The empire he had served with such devotion was disintegrating. Entire divisions in China were cut off, the navy was gone, and the army at home could scarcely feed itself. Yet orders from the War Ministry still demanded resistance to the end. High above, American bombers now carried a different kind of weapon. On August the 6th and 9th, 1945, two flashes of unnatural light changed the world forever. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated in moments. For those who survived, the sky seemed to burn and then turn silent. Within days the emperor made a decision no Japanese ruler had ever made before, to end the war. On August 15th, his voice, calm and distant, was broadcast across the nation. Many citizens had never heard it before. The words were formal, almost poetic, but the meaning was unmistakable. Japan would surrender. Across the ruined country people knelt in stunned silence. Some wept in relief, others in disbelief. For years they had been told that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Now he asked them to live. On Okinawa, the guns finally fell quiet. American soldiers stood among the wreckage, staring at the sea where thousands had fought and died. The battle that had begun with fire ended with rain falling on empty trenches. In Tokyo Bay, on September 2, 1945, the Japanese delegation boarded the battleship USS Missouri. General Douglas MacArthur waited on deck, surrounded by officers from every Allied nation. At 9:04 a.m., Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the Instrument of Surrender. The war that had engulfed the world for 6 years was over for Japan. The cost was almost beyond measure. Millions of lives lost, cities turned to dust, an empire reduced to hunger and ruins. Yet out of that destruction came something unexpected: rebirth. In the years that followed, the same discipline and determination that had once fueled conquest would rebuild a nation devoted to peace. Admiral Nishi did not live to see it. History records that he met his end soon after the surrender, leaving behind a final message asking forgiveness for the young men he had sent to die. Whether one sees him as a patriot or a man crushed by his own creation, his legacy remains one of the most haunting in the war's history. The story of Okinawa is not just a chronicle of battle, it is the story of humanity pushed to its limit. It shows how courage can become tragedy when guided by despair, and how even in the darkest hour, compassion can return. Today, the hills of Okinawa are green again. Children play where once the earth shook under artillery fire. Memorial stones stand on the cliffs where soldiers and civilians alike perished. The sea that swallowed so many now glitters peacefully under the sun, and yet, when the wind moves through the grass, it carries echoes of that spring in 1945, the roar of engines, the crash of waves, the voices of men who believed their sacrifice would save their homeland. They were called Kamikaze, the divine wind. History remembers them not for victory, but for what they reveal about the human heart in war, its devotion, its delusion, and its unending desire for meaning. Even at the edge of oblivion, the war was over. The empire was gone. But from its ashes, Japan would rise again, not through conquest, but through resilience, art, and peace. And so ended the last stand of the rising sun.